Hello everyone, and welcome back to Ghost of Tsushima vs. InFamous, part 2 of this series where we decide whether the old or the new is superior. It's at this point where we need to talk about karma. No, not some mystical force that teenage girls post about on social media, along with their dumb astrology. Instead, this is a gameplay system that tracks how good or evil the player's decisions have been. The title InFamous alludes to this, how the player can be famous to the citizens of Empire City as a hero, or add the "in" to it by being a supervillain who takes whatever he wants without remorse.
He doesn't want to be famous, and I'll make him infamous!
I appreciate the way Sucker Punch's games approach their karma systems, but it's impossible to shake the feeling that they both trip at the finish line.
Look at my cool new...
After the blast and waking up with powers, Cole has to decide what kind of person he wants to be. Remember that he was a nobody, maybe we can even go as far as to call him an outcast. Without any order or stability, he can now reinvent himself in any way he wants with these new powers. The player can choose whether to be good or evil through their choices in the game. Most of these karmic decisions boil down to the relatable scenario of whether Cole wants to help the people of Empire City or focus on saving his own skin. Selflessness versus selfishness. A perfect example of this is when the Reapers are pumping a hypnotic tar into the drinking water. Shutting valves to contain the tar causes it to blast in Cole's face. This has gameplay consequences by reducing the maximum amount of energy he can absorb, so the player gets the choice to force a bystander to shut a valve instead. Some other choices are a little silly, but sheer fun. For the most part, karmic decisions and their consequences are well established and further the theme of self-sacrifice. However, InFamous does stumble here because of just how polarizing the karmic system is. Players will either strive towards the hero or InFamous ranks with no desire for anything in between. See, the thing is, InFamous keeps all the most powerful moves unlocked at the most extremes, so in order to become stronger, the player needs to be more polarized. This desire to be more polarized, to be stronger, prevents players from making any complex moral decisions or addressing choices based on their own merits. Now, for the sake of getting footage of evil choices, I sacrifice some of my good karma, but 99% of players won't do this. Most people will just decide whether to be good or evil before starting, and then go all in. This also prevents any gray or morally ambiguous choices from ever reaching the player. All role-playing games with karmic systems have the pure good and evil choices, but it's often the ones that don't impact karma which are the most interesting. Take Oasis in the contemporary Fallout 3. I just did a video on it, so I still have the footage. There's a man who's been stuck inside a tree for years. Harold is miserable and wants you to give him a mercy killing, but the local people love him. Some even want him to grow so the wasteland can be greener. Do you fulfill his wish? Do you help DC recover? Leave him as a god for the townspeople? It's an interesting moral choice for the player to make, and the game won't judge you for it, unless you burn Harold alive. Torturing an innocent soul is obviously bad. InFamous lacks these kinds of choices. I don't mean to sound overly negative. There are a lot of excellent karma moments in InFamous, but they do get undermined by the upgrade system and lack of ambiguity. Onto Ghost of Tsushima. Its great approach to karma is to not include it. Crazy, I know. As I mentioned before, Lord Sakai is his own character who makes his own decisions unguided by player choice. You know what? I really like this approach to video games. Not that karma doesn't have its place, but it's nice to just sit back and enjoy the story the protagonist we play as. This has been Naughty Dog's approach to characters. The player may choose how they want to engage in combat, but the characters and story stay the same no matter who's playing. It's easier to enjoy character development when it's not just one of many options. No matter what the player wants, Joel will always save Ellie and lie to her in the end because that's who he is as a person. I can't take Nathan Drake and make him all powerful from the Chintamani stone. The same goes for Sakai. He will always choose to embrace stealth as a legitimate fighting strategy. He will always choose to be the ghost instead of Lord Shimura's son, and he will always kill Khotun Khan. There's no ending where you join the Mongols, guys. The player does receive some choice in the dialogue. While horse riding with another character, you can choose between 2 speech options. This has no consequences outside of answering questions the player cares about or expressing our feelings to someone. The lack of consequences to speech lets us actually choose the dialogue we want instead of worrying what that speech will do. Dang, sometimes I wish this were true in real life. Anyway, all this is great in the context of the game, except for that ending. After winning the duel against Shimura, Sakai gets to decide whether or not to spare him, the uncle who raised him since he was a kid, who taught him how to fight, who even offered to formally adopt him. We've seen Sakai make several crucial choices up to this point, fleshing out his character, but now suddenly at the most interesting of all of them, the ending is left up to the player. I didn't want to determine the outcome. I wanted Sakai to do that, so I see more of who he is. I wouldn't say the random choice at the end ruins the ending, but the random choice at the end kinda ruins the ending. With Ghost 2, I don't want to sound overly critical, but this gripe should be noted. InFamous and Ghost of Tsushima are very different in the way they play. This makes sense, considering how in one you play as a superhero and the other a samurai. There are some holdovers in the latter that were clearly inspired by the former. An obvious example would be climbing. The 2009 release took place in a ruined cityscape, so it made sense for the hero to be climbing buildings and scrambling across rooftops. Ghost is set in 13th century Japan. Obviously, there are no skyscrapers to climb, so this game mechanic isn't as prevalent here. Even without much use, Sucker Punch still improved upon it tremendously. InFamous makes players spam the X button to climb from one ledge to the next, and sometimes they'd be far enough apart to the point where you'd have to correctly time a double jump to reach your goal. It isn't a bad system, but surely people get tired of spamming the same button. When controlling Lord Sakai, you just point him in the right direction and he moves that way. It's simple, smooth, and straightforward. InFamous introduces a power called Karmic Overload, which gives the player a temporary surge of when the player hits pure good or pure evil, again coercing players into being at a pole. It's super useful when taking on large groups of enemies. Sucker Punch must have noted the fun of this ability, cause it makes a return in 2020. Around the midpoint of the adventure, during the Battle of Yarikawa, players unlock the Ghost Stance, which sees Jin slaughter 3 of any enemy in rapid succession and strike fear into the survivors. Since karma isn't a thing in this game, the Ghost Stance gets a recharge after killing a number of enemies in a row without taking damage or by stealth killing a Mongol general. Both the Karmic Overload and Ghost Stance are amazing and purely epic powers to unleash on our foes. These two games are also great in terms of difficulty. Some of Ghost's bosses are spongy and irritating to get through, but besides that, the player feels as though they're getting much more powerful as the story progresses, yet the gameplay still feels challenging. It sounds kinda like an oxymoron, but Sucker Punch pulled this off, twice. It's super satisfying to strike my foes down with lightning or explode a pack of Mongols, but neither game ever feels like it's gotten any easier. Being open world games, they do have some more obvious similarities to find, but in my opinion, one handles its world much better. This is in terms of gameplay, I mean. I'll get into the visuals and world building later in the video. As far as open worlds go, Sucker Punch handled Empire City very well, even by today's standards. For some reason, developers over the past decade have gone for a mentality, when this isn't the case. It's not the size that makes a world, but how you use it. And InFamous proves this. Empire City is a small sandbox, but man, it is dense. Every block feels unique, like it has a specific role in the story and setting. There's no empty space to serve as filler here. Traversal in InFamous is some of the most satisfying I've ever seen in a video game. Most of the area is connected by elevated trains and large webs of electrical wires to speed across. Empire City is big enough to feel like a real city to play in as a sandbox, but also small enough to not need a fast travel system. Induction grinding around is fun enough to the point where I don't want to fast travel. Also, one either genius idea or beautiful accident is to have the islands on the map form a triangle. That way, if you need to move from one borough to another, the distance will always be short. You'll never need to ride for ages to reach your destination. But all this isn't available to you from the start. Instead, the creators slowly introduce the world, drawing back the curtains one area at a time. Cole's movements are confined to unlocked boroughs and areas on those boroughs with power. Well, you can explore the dark areas, but prepare to get turreted to heck. As more of the map becomes available, more transportation tools are given to the player. The induction grind allows you to ride on wires and rails, the static thrusters let you glide through the air, and each island has a train that can be activated at a certain point to ride. When all these elements come together, traversal flows magically because the player is engaged in aiming for power lines, thrusting from one building to the next, and climbing back up if need be. And maybe that's the problem with big open worlds. They just don't have interesting ways to move across them like Empire City. Tsushima is guilty of this. The latest map is way too big with a lot of filler. There are 3 means of transportation in Ghost of Tsushima, either A, running, B, riding a horse, or C, fast traveling. You can cross out running since that would take forever, so your main mode of transportation is horse riding, for places you haven't been yet. Tsushima Island is so big and riding a horse isn't nearly as engaging as jumping across rooftops. So whenever the option is available, the player, or at least just me, will always use the fast travel when it's available. I don't have a vendetta against fast travel mechanics, but the fact that I actively want to skip world traversal raises red flags. It should never be used as a crutch. I shouldn't always want to fast travel because normal transportation is too boring. Riding Nobu just isn't very fun. All you do is point him in a direction and have him run. That's about it. Then just to get me tight, the riders kill him off.
Liar!
And this may sound like a silly nitpick, but remember how Empire City being a triangle is useful? Well, Tsushima Island is a straight line. Yes, I know it's a real place and this is what it looks like, but there's no way anyone would care to ride from Kamigata to Izuhara. The distance is just way too far for any player to deal with, so they'll use fast travel as a crutch. Want to go from the historic district back to the neon? No problem, just ride the line. Sucker Punch made a mechanically perfect world and mode of transport back in 2009 and then completely forgot how in 2020. Both the new release and the classic also incorporate a lot of environmental tools to help combat groups of enemies. This has been an industry standard for well over a decade, but honestly, I feel like the Grandpa embraces this a lot more. Cole can take down thugs by exploding a car in their face, shocking barrels of propane, electrocuting the water they're standing in, throwing them off of rooftops, detonating suicide bombers, and crushing with cars. There are so many options, and all of these options feel naturally integrated into the world. A few times it feels obvious, like the game set them up specifically for Cole to use, but usually it's more that you're using the concrete jungle against your rivals in the most natural sense, creating a feeling of interaction with the world. Even the way you revive yourself feels woven into the urban setting as Cole sucks up electricity from his surroundings. Ghost of Tsushima uses Resolve, so Lord Sakai sorta just wills himself to be better. Resolve is gained through killing enemies, parrying attacks, and doing otherwise cool samurai things. It's an okay system, but one that's obviously not as cool as the former. Oh yeah, and the way environmental takedowns are handled here feels much more on the nose than before. You'll find beehives to swarm and explosive barrels to detonate, but most of the time they feel so out of place, like they're only there for the player to use in this one specific instance rather than an actual piece of the setting. And they'll be pointed out just in case players are too dumb to notice. I do appreciate how in some instances bears can be used to clear out enemies, but this is very rare and they don't get far before being put down. One major difference though is how InFamous plays with a much faster pace, feeling more like a shooter than some of its contemporary superhero games. The player will duck behind cover, try to find a good angle on their enemies, and blast away. Comograph gets a wide range of abilities, and most of them are great at kicking butt and are so satisfying to use. Two exceptions would be the Karma-based powers, Arc Lightning and Overload Burst. They're too weak and slow to use, rendering them useless. Ghost is far slower and more methodical. It's very similar to the Arkham games where you block and counter certain attacks, but then have to dodge others. Combat moves like a dance, as you have to read your opponent's moves and counter. You'll need to change stances to deal with different enemy types, which adds a fun layer of stress to the mix. Players begin with the stone stance, which is good for taking out sword guys, then learn the water stance, which is good for shield guys, and so on. Before a fight, you might take inventory of the weapons at your disposal, because some of them can be really helpful in combat, like the kunais and black powder bombs. Then while the battle is happening, you'll be planning who to attack in what order. There's much more of a back and forth. Plus, a large portion of enemy engagements is done through stealth, which requires lots of strategizing. A single encounter that would take Comograph less than a minute might take Jin 5 times that amount. This isn't to say that InFamous doesn't take skill or that Ghost doesn't have exciting moments, this is just the general way both games are paced. I wouldn't call one style better than the other. It comes down to personal preference. Some days I want a fast-paced shooter, other days I want slower, more strategic fights. They both have their moments and master what they do. InFamous has many awesome powers for the player to use and integrates them well into the urban environment that runs on electricity, while the sword combat is incredible and maybe the best I've played within a game to date. Director Nate Fox and the devs at Sucker Punch wanted to create the quintessential samurai experience and certainly succeeded. Oh my gosh, some of the most satisfying moments in all of gaming come from slicing Mongol throats in a standoff. The slow motion, the sword whoosh, the streak of blood that flows, it's so dunking epic. Nailing enemies in the head with the half bow also feels so good, like injecting dopamine straight into your veins.
I wrote a blog post a while ago about why I f***ing hate video games, because this is what it does, it appeals to like the male fantasy.
I wonder if Sensei Ishikawa survived the invasion.
Before I move on, I should mention the stealth mechanics. InFamous and its sequels never had a stealth system. Cole always took fights head on. There was no way to sneak in and get kills. However, much of Ghost's gameplay revolves around sneaking and assassinating Mongols. For the most part, it's simple and fun. The devs aren't shredding new ground or blowing minds here. You sneak up on someone, kill them, and hide again. Or you could try to rack up the quiet kills with your bow. There are other items to help clear enemies, but again, nothing you haven't seen before. This stealth mode continues until you're caught, leading to full combat, or you disappoint your uncle by assassinating everyone. Nothing spectacular, but fun. One nitpick I have with it though is the tall grass system. I don't know why, but for some reason PS4 games have developed an unhealthy obsession with this mediocre sneaking mechanic where players hide from bad guys in tall grass. It makes no sense. People should still see you and hear you. Heck, it even works on animals that should be super perceptive. And how long does it take for the enemies to realize, "Don't go into the long grass!" Guys, I don't know why creators over and over again look at this system and think, yeah, this is awesome, we have to bring this into our new release. Uncharted 4, Horizon Zero Dawn, The Last of Us 2, and now Ghost of Tsushima. Can you guys cut it out already? It was never that good to begin with. Unfortunately, this would not be an honest review if I didn't mention that Ghost of Tsushima has the dreaded Arkham Knight syndrome. Consistent viewers of my channel know what this is. Arkham Knight syndrome is my name for when a video game has top-notch quality gameplay mechanics, but the way these mechanics are utilized is questionable to say the least. Man, I didn't expect so many Arkham comparisons in this analysis, but Ghost is stricken with this disease. I love a lot of these mechanics, but boy oh boy is it repetitive. Ghost of Tsushima will cost you around 40 hours, more if you're a completionist, and so much of that time is clearing encampment after encampment, town after town. It is so annoying. the entire map is sprinkled with dozens of areas to clear out of Mongols. This is a lot of the filler in the map I mentioned before. But even if you want to ignore all the Mongol territories, the main story and many side quests will still make you rid forts of invaders. It's like Sucker Punch had a serious addiction to this task and they would get the shakes if they didn't write in another Mongol fight or base cleansing in every 5 minutes. And sometimes you'll have to rescue hostages, release falcons, or find banners on top of that. I cannot express into words how peeved I get playing Ghost sometimes. The endless liberations have whittled away my soul. I feel so bad for all the completionists who will try to 100% this. My heart goes out to you. Now, above fighting off Mongol encampments come actual side quests, the Tales of Tsushima. I'll be honest, I didn't do too many of these. I played a few in Izuhara and simply wasn't impressed in the slightest. But maybe they get better later on, who knows. The one that left such a bad taste in my mouth was Whisper in the Woods. This side quest has a great setup. A traveler warns you that people have been going missing in the woods due to a vengeful spirit. It's dark. The further along you go, the more hanging bodies you find. People are killed in their sleep. Spoopy stuff for sure. But then after all this great build up, Jin finds a handful of super basic, easy to wipe the floor with bandits. That's it. Really easy bandits. Yeah, Ghost goes for a very grounded in reality approach, so obviously actual spirits were off the table, but come on! There are so many more interesting places the writers could have gone with this. So yeah, the quest sucked, the reward sucked, so I stopped caring about side missions altogether. I mentioned this in the previous part, but the same goes for the character quests. I don't find them all that engaging with the exception of Ishukawa's and kinda Yuna's. Usually they're just more of the same. But holy heck, are the mythic quests great? Where was this talent when it came to those other missions? It's like if in school the smart students got put into a group and the dumb ones in another group. That's what happened at Sucker Punch. The great writers had the task of writing the Heavenly Strike, while the ones who wrote Second Son did the Value of Sake. InFamous, thank God for you InFamous, doesn't have any of these problems. In fact, it blows Ghost out of the water with the amount of creative levels and challenges created out of the basic gameplay loop. I don't know if the same quest writers were brought back for Ghost development, but if not, Sucker Punch should be ashamed of themselves. Cole receives races against the clock, guarded trucks he has to bring down, manhunts where you have to find an undercover conduit, prisoners to safely escort across town, karmic choices to make, packages to find, some strongholds to clear, couriers to follow, gang fights to intervene in, trails to follow, surveillance equipment to destroy, and double stacking pictures to pose for. There is so much variety that it never gets old. And even if there is repetition in the gameplay, like in Ghost, the much faster pace means you don't even feel it. It's not like you're spending 15 minutes clearing a base. Not every side quest is under 5 minutes. Actually, they're usually a lot less. The newer release incorporates some of these ideas, but compared to the, at most, 15-hour runtime of InFamous, they're much fewer and further between, relatively and probably objectively speaking too. InFamous just had so many creative ways to use Cole's powers and recontextualize it in order to create many fun missions. Like in the prison level, Alden in Chains, it starts almost like a rhythm game as you time the shockwave to blast bombs away. Against the World has you really making the most out of those static thrusters to try and glide onto toxic spewing balloons. There's so much variety to keep players engaged. To be fair, there are a few main quests that feel like filler, and one or two that aren't fun, but InFamous never goes into the bad territory. Not every mission can be a banger. Can we give Sucker Punch a round of applause for a moment? This team did a phenomenal job with both their 2009 and 2020 releases. Like I said in the previous part, the main characters both awaken in a ravished version of their respective worlds. Death and destruction is everywhere, and the creators sold this idea so well through so much excellent visual storytelling. Ghost of Tsushima hangs the corpses of Japanese citizens throughout the island like Christmas ornaments. Bloodied bodies line the abandoned roads, making nice little speed bumps for Jin's horse. Death is everywhere, yet Tsushima Island is insanely beautiful. Probably the most gorgeous video game setting I've ever seen. Every time the player turns around comes another amazing scenic painting that would make Bob Ross proud. Man, Tsushima is so colorful, so vibrant, and has so many different environments to explore. Izuhara has various forests to run through, Toyotama has vast fields, golden forests, and rice farms, and Kamigata is snowy and mountainous. It's such a varied place, and every variation looks equally great. What awesome juxtaposition this game has. Even when human affairs are horrible and brutal, nature still remains beautiful as always, and ultimately makes the final decision. InFamous, on the other hand, was never graphically impressive, even by 2009 standards. Character models and their animations are severely lacking, looking silly most of the time. The creators made up for the shortcomings by using comic panels to fill in the gaps, bringing the emotional weight that the in-game graphics can't. But even without the looks of other PS3 games, InFamous still uses what it has very well. Empire City is very similar to Tsushima in that the setting is completely ravished, in this case by the race fear and gangs that rose to take the streets. And again, the world is divided into 3 areas, each with a unique style which marks the different acts. The Neon District, well, is self-explanatory. It's the most modern borough with buildings draped in neon lights and fancy parks with fancy architecture. As a slight nitpick, maybe it doesn't have as much neon as it should, certainly not enough to give it the name. All this is contrasted by the second act's Warren District, which was a mess even before the blast. The whole island is covered in slums and straight up garbage, at least more than usual in this city. The final island, the Historic District, is called so because it was the first one developed into a city. I like this one especially because the age shows through the Art Deco architecture that's remnant of the early 20th century. And I'll have you know that Art Deco is always appreciated on this channel. Then, like Ghost, destruction is then blanketed on top of all these surroundings. In my opinion, InFamous does an even better job at showing the people's desperation through visual storytelling, like how the injured and the dead will lie on streets en masse, or how pedestrians will rummage through the garbage looking for food. The city itself feels more like a character as average citizens respond to you in accordance with your karma. If they like you, they'll cheer you on, and even snap pictures. If they don't, then they'll chuck rocks at you and start throwing hands. Ghost doesn't do these things even with better technology and more resources. Aside from special NPCs who are part of quests, the majority of them just walk around aimlessly and will bow back to Jin. The player will get gifts at altars, but they feel detached from the people they're supposed to be from, since they seem to just magically spawn every now and then. So the interaction with the world is limited, or at least isn't presented in an impactful way. Lord Sakai's given up everything for these guys, yet that connection feels lost. Let me not be too hard on Ghost though. One other thing I do appreciate about it is how the game guides you from quest to quest by using the wind. I've played with quest arrows and quest markers before, but this is maybe the most creative player guidance I've seen in a video game. It ties the player to the divine winds that will ultimately save Japan and the spirituality it entails. Plus, all of nature reacts to these winds too, again showing off how beautiful Tsushima Island is. This has been such a fun analysis to make for both Sucker Punch games. I've thoroughly enjoyed playing and comparing them for this overlong video analysis that I honest to God thought wouldn't take more than 20 minutes. Doesn't Sucker Punch know that I want to move on to Prehistoric Kingdom and more dinosaur documentaries? Sheesh. Yeah, so going into these two overly bloated videos, I actually wasn't sure which is truly better, whether Sucker Punch has evolved or regressed. But that's art, I guess, exploring an idea, not knowing the end result, but hoping to find something in the end. After looking at both Ghost of Tsushima and InFamous, I can say that they're both great PlayStation exclusives that make me proud to not have had an Xbox since the original. But the answer became clear to me when I had to go back and replay these games to record footage. I was very excited to revisit InFamous, but Ghost of Tsushima I felt more of a meh, alright I guess. The two have great stories, great characters, great settings, and great gameplay mechanics, but overall, InFamous is more enjoyable, since in some aspects we see it shoot for quality rather than quantity, while Ghost went for This comparison shows that having more and more of the same as gaming creates bigger and bigger worlds isn't inherently a good thing. I'd rather have few but more fun and more varied missions along with a smaller, more compact setting than the alternative. Video games should be enjoyable, and InFamous is more enjoyable. So now back to the central question, is Ghost of Tsushima an evolution or a regression? Well, both. The technology has definitely evolved to give us more realistic animations, gorgeous sceneries, and less bugs. It's a more polished game altogether, but in terms of exploration, quest structures, and the gameplay loop, there has been regression into the generic open world formulas we've seen. There's so much more content in the new release, but much of that content is repetitive or not up to the same level of quality as that of InFamous. So Sucker Punch, try to learn from these successes and failures so that next time you can absolutely knock it out of the park. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to please leave a like, subscribe, and check out my social media. See you next time.